If you want to have a conversation about David Hockney, a good place to start is with Lawrence Weschler. He is the author of True to Life, 25 Years of Conversations with David Hockney. It's a lot of conversations, right? Weschler is prolific, original, and insightful. He was a staff writer for The New Yorker from 1981 until 2002, the director of the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU from 2001 to 2013. He's now the director emeritus. And among his many other books are Domestic Scenes, The Art of Ramiro Gomez. We'll be hearing more about that tonight. Robert Irwin, The Getty Garden, and Seen is Forgetting the Name of the Thing One Sees, a life of contemporary artist Robert Irwin. Joining him on stage now are Tassida Dean, a visual artist best known for her work in film. She is one of the, quote, young British artists whose work was included in the 1995 Venice Biennale, and she was elected to the Royal Academy of Arts in 2008. We'll be showing her film this evening. Ramiro Gomez, the youngest of our participants, was born in San Bernardino, California, to undocumented Mexican immigrant parents who have since become US citizens. His first solo gallery exhibition was in 2014 in Los Angeles, and since then his work has shown widely across North America. And finally, experimental physicist Charles Falco has collaborated with David Hockney since 2000. Their Hockney-Falco thesis offers scientific evidence that paintings made as early as 1430 were created with the aid of optical devices. Falco is a fellow of the American Physical Society and the Optical Society of America. He has published more than 250 scientific manuscripts and has 7 US patents. At the latter part of the program, the panel will be joined, they will enjoy a visit with David Hockney's latest hero, Father Pavel Florensky. Now I want to welcome Lawrence Weschler and the panelists.
Thank you, Peter. This is very exciting to be able to celebrate David for all of us. We're each going to, three of them will each present for about 15, 60 minutes each, and then we're going to get into our celebration of the Russian Orthodox monk, Pavel Florensky. I think we're going to start with Tassida Dean. Tassida has been making some wonderful short films about artists, and recently did one about David. And what I like most about them is a kind of sense of inhabiting the interior of the artist and watching the artist looking and watching the artist thinking, and in David's case, more. Let's put it that way. Tassida, did you want to say one or two words about your film? And then, by the way, the rest of all of us might just go sit there during the showing of the film, then we'll come back up stage. But just say a few words to introduce it.
It's called Portraits. You'll see why it's called Portraits, because David was working on his portrait series at the time. And I suddenly realized, well, he also did a portrait of my son, Rufus, which is still kind of hanging in the background. So it's a portrait, my portrait of David, and surrounded by portraits that he has painted of other people, including Rufus. And then, as you see, it's 5 portraits within the one portrait. So it was a way of sort of finding the title was to pluralize the word portrait. As you'll see, he's smoking cigarettes. The original intention was just to do 1 cigarette, but in the end, it became 5 cigarettes. And in each one, there's a kind of there's a different quality of his presence in how he smokes, and it was a way of just observe. My films, as I see them, are more about depiction than they are about anything else. So it was a way of observing David.
This is, by the way, one of the first times it's been shown.
Oh, it's the first time at the Getty.
Okay, there you go. The first time in front of us, so what does it matter? So maybe we should.
And actually, it's an artwork, so it's not usually shown like this to a captive audience.
Yeah.
It's usually shown much smaller. It's on a loop system, and it actually doesn't have a beginning or an end. So it's just an eternal cycle of David smoking. And so what you'll notice is there's a hard cut at the front and the hard cut at the end. And that's because the two ends would be cut together. And so it just goes round and round and round.
It's about 13, 14 minutes long, and so why don't we get off stage and there's a completely wacky, wonderful book that I sometimes refer to called The Origins of European Thought on Life, Death, the Soul, Fate. It goes on like that, many, many words, around 1950 by an English philologist named R.B. O'Nyans, who, looking at the language, is able to figure out all kinds of fascinating things about how people in pre-Hippocratic, pre-Socratic Greece, for example, and also in Sanskrit in India, thought about how the body worked. And apparently it was thought that the seat of vision was the lungs. Which, why not? I mean, why would we think it's the brain or the tongue or anyway? But it was thought to be the lungs, and this remains with us today in inspiration, respiration, words like that and so forth. And in the case of David, I mean, he may be the proof. I don't know. What was he looking at in your various takes?
He was looking at one of his portraits, I think, of his sister.
And I mean, it's really, for those of us who've had the great good fortune to be able to be in the studio with him, it's just fascinating, the amount of looking that goes into painting.
I think that's what the cigarette is for him, because he doesn't smoke when he paints, but he smokes to reflect and to think.
Right. And when he was laughing, was he looking at a movie or something?
No, he was looking at JP.
I see, right, his assistant.
But it's very contagious. I mean, I don't know anybody who's not
right.
affected by the last moment of that film when they're not laughing too.
Right.
Just...
But there was an earlier scene where he was laughing a few times while he was smoking.
That was when he was looking at.
That was also the same.
JP.
Anyway, I want to move over a little bit to Charles here, but one of the things at the beginning of the movie brought through is that he reads voraciously. He is self-educated in a profound sense, and I mean he had his art school education and so forth, but his real education is in thick tomes of history or so forth. Recently, just the other day, he was talking about a Van Gogh book he's currently reading, 900 pages. He's halfway through. He especially savors the mother. But that in turn brings you, I mean, in some sense to Charles, your sense of him, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how you got to know him and so forth.
So this is not a lecture. This is a conversation that we're going to have, and the images I'm going to show are just as a reminder, just to trigger a conversation. So some years ago, in 2000, this piece by Weschler appeared in The New Yorker. In making a long story short, as a result of it, I was put in contact with David to see what he was doing. And this actually, at first glance, might seem ridiculous because this is my lab, and a paper that I published about the same time as I was introduced to Briwan study of long wavelength waves in quasi-monotonic cobalt films. It's got nothing to do with art history.
Oh, are you kidding? I saw that and I said, we got to get Falco.
Yeah. So
we should say, by the way, that the article in the New Yorker was about the beginnings of David's ideas that old masters were using optical devices. At that point, he was talking about Angler, and then going back maybe as far as Caravaggio. He wasn't sure, but it had kind of ended there. But
and I should have mentioned that David at the time had an idea that these artists, it's a whole lecture in itself, either used eyeballing, like if I were going to paint Wren, I would kind of do something like this, or optics in some sense. Well, I'm a professor of optical sciences, but in fact, the fact that I've done photography ever since I was 5 years old or even younger allowed me, when I saw David's studio, to see that optics definitely was used. And I didn't know enough about art history to know that art historians say optics couldn't have been used for reasons that are completely wrong.
We should mention, by the way, in the film we saw David's studio, which, as you may know, is built over a tennis court, so those are the dimensions. It's long and thin. And by the time, it hadn't happened yet when I published the article in the New Yorker, but in the few months since then, David had done the kind of thing that David often does. He mobilizes his quite capacious library. He put in a color Xerox machine in the middle of the studio, and he began Xeroxing the history of European art from 1350 to 1800. Far to the left, 1350, far to the right, 1800. Up was Northern Europe, down was Southern Europe, and he just started, shellacking. It was like building a roof, just put things on top of each other and so forth. And he would Xerox that, and what year is that? He'd put that there and so forth. And the question he was asking himself is, where does this optical look begin to happen? And he thought it was going to be at Caravaggio, but he began to notice it seemed to happen much earlier. And at that moment, you walked in.
Well, and so it wasn't like a tile. It was like Mendeleev putting together the periodic table. And so in a very scientific fashion, this fact, Northern Europe on the upper wall, Southern Europe on the lower wall, this is a scientist does things this way. This is not how you think about an artist doing things. And so I faxed David a few days later an 8-page calculation, and as a result, after 3 months into our collaboration, we'd exchanged a ream of faxes, 500 pages of faxes, and by the time that this sort of phase ended, we'd exchanged 3,000 pages of faxes. This is how David communicated at the time. This is, by any measure, the most intensive scientific collaboration of my career. And this is about David. This is about how David thinks. So here, David and I are communicating. He is an artist, a self-educated artist, and I'm not having any trouble having conversations with him. It's not like I know equations and David doesn't know equations, so we can't communicate. I can't even think of an example. I might have said spherical aberration, and David would have said fuzzy or something, but it wasn't even that distinct. So David...
By the way, there's a great quote about the relationship between artists and scientists by the great Russian lepidopterist, butterfly scientist, some of you may know, named Vladimir Nabokov. And he says that the true master needs the precision of the poet and the imagination of the scientist.
So I was collaborating with a scientist this whole time. And so David visited my lab. Ren came along on that trip. So I have several electron microscopes in my lab. There's fluorescent screens. The fluorescent screens are green. Every scientist knows they're green. Countless scientists walk through. Nobody says anything because they're green. David asks, why that particular hue of green? And that's just an example of how he looked at the world. And I mean, he taught me, I can't tell you how much David had taught me as a result of his approach to life, his scientific approach. Now, he painted my portrait. He's actually done 3 of my portraits. And so one of them, I'm in his studio over the course of 2 days, and I sit and I took notes. And more than taking notes, he would make me sit still for an hour or so as he painted very intensively. After an hour or so, he needed a break because he was working he was very intense. And so I got to get up and wander around. I took a photograph of my portrait as it stood at that time. So what I've done is I've pieced together all these portraits, and it's a time-lapse photo of a movie, very brief, of 1-hour segments. And I should say, I was in town for a conference, and the first day I'm all bright and alert, David Hockney's painting me. The second day, which was 2 days later, I'd been out really late. I mean, really, really late. And so
Let's stop for a second and talk about that.
And so you will see my face, if you watch, change. Because I was very tired the second time. So this is a very short clip. And so You see, he hasn't done my legs yet. At some point, my legs are brown. I'm wearing charcoal gray pants, but he painted my legs brown. I asked David, why did you do that? He said, oh, the highlights are brown. Well, who knows that? David knows that. And so he always viewed me as, and then at the end, there's my tired face on the left. I'm more awake on the right. And so I had one of the people in his studio take my picture standing exactly where David was standing. And so that's me observing David.
But by the way, let's be clear. David, interestingly, was not using optical instruments when he was doing that. And it's important to understand that David, during this period, really 17, 18 years ago, when he was coming up with these ideas, he wasn't celebrating the use of optical instruments, he wasn't decrying it, but he was making a point that there was a period, and by the way, he noticed that it happened, if you do that experiment with what he called the Great Wall, it happens overnight in 1430. 1425, 1430, it's like Europe puts on its glasses. It's like before people would struggle, there's awkwardness, and then suddenly it's exact, there's a kind of thing that's an optical look. And it starts, oddly enough, in Bruges and then moves on to Florence. And when you would talk to David about why that was happening, he'd say, well, if you were a 19th century English art theorist, do you want to go to spend your summers in Florence or do you want to go and spend your summers in Bruges, in industrial Belgium? But in any case, the point, just ending, is that he points out that if you look at this map, starting in 1430 and eventually going all the way to 1830, there is a look, which is the optical look that is the kind of look. It's not that every scientist, every painter is using optics, but that what reality looks like is the kind of look you get out of optics. And starting in 1839, and you just see it immediately, European painters begin to stop doing that because chemical photography has been invented. And so painters start doing impressionism, expressionism, cubism, and so forth. And so in any case, in this instance, it's quite the case that he is not using optical instruments.
So he did one time paint my portrait with a camera obscura as an experiment, as a scientific experiment to see what it was like. The important point about this is actually not that these artists like Caravaggio used optics, where we've shown them. Optics solves a lot of problems. If I look over here, if there were lights, I could see this part of the audience. I know there's a part of an audience over there, but I can't see them. So if I photographed this, I can capture this part. The photographic process, or a lens projecting an image, does great things. It takes this entire three-dimensional world and it puts it in two dimensions in a useful fashion. And so it creates for you something that's actually useful for you. So even if an artist didn't project an image, as David would say, the optics don't make marks. They present an image in front of the artist, and he can decide what to use, what not to use, and the like. And once you've seen projected images, it's kind of hard to get out of your mind. It seemed like a really bad movie. It's hard to get it out of your mind. So optics influences you indirectly as well. And the indirect use of the optics is actually a lot more interesting than the direct use of optics. And if anyone's interested in this, it turns out that somebody, Amy Ellen, did her master's thesis in art education about David Hockney's and my collaboration, examining why it is somebody who's a hardcore scientist could so easily collaborate with an artist, and vice versa. And Ren talked about it from the beginning. David is extremely widely read and completely open. So when I have discussions with David, if he had some idea that was scientifically impossible, if I said to David, no, that's not correct, that can't be, it must be something different, he was completely receptive to that. He was not arguing some point of view. He wanted to get to the truth, which is what the scientist's job description is as well, is to take a piece of the world and try to understand that piece of the world. That's David's approach to life, and why I'm just incredibly grateful to have that period of time. One time I went to his studio, he was getting back into watercolors. I told David, everything I learned about watercolors I learned in kindergarten. He then spent an hour with me showing me how to mix watercolors, teaching me all sorts of things about watercolors. And I thought, what art student, what would they pay for an hour's master class with David Hockney in watercolors?
But anyway, great. Is that the last slide? I think
That's the last slide.
Okay. Let us move over to Ramiro here for a second. And that's a story that I can start with. I was in Chicago, when did we decide? 2014? And whenever I go, I would go to Chicago regularly, and I always go to the Art Institute, and I go on my, it'll be showing up in a second, I go on my Stations of the Cross at the Art Institute, and I went to one of my favorite paintings, which is this famous painting of David's of the Weismans, Frederick and Marcia Weisman here in LA. It's called American Collectors. I always think of it as Portrait of an Impending Divorce. But in any case, so I liked that. I savored that. I stood in front of it for a little while, and then I went out. It happened that Art Expo was taking place, which is the big fair. And I went there, and I came in, I rounded the corner, and exactly the same painting was there. And I said, wait a second. I just saw that painting. It was the same dimensions and so forth. And this was in a booth of a local LA gallery, the Charlie James Gallery. And I went up to James and I said, so what's the deal with this? And he said that there was this young Latino artist in LA whose parents had been undocumented workers when they arrived. Parenthetically, his parents have become American citizens owing to the arch-radical Ronald Reagan's amnesty program. Somehow that was possible in those days. But in any case, one of the things that Charlie said to me was that this young artist had done about 12 or 13 of them, of these pastiches based on David Hockney, in this case called American Gardener. The first one actually was based on a bigger splash and was called No Splash. And the thing this is just a lesson for dealers and for journalists. The real karma here was that he said that this young artist had done 13 or 14 of them, and he was selling them like hotcakes, and he could go on doing this for the rest of his life, and he had stopped doing it. And Charlie was really frustrated. He said, God, he called the kid, if the kid could just keep doing it, we could really make a lot of money, but he said he'd made his point, and he was going to do other stuff. And that's when I had the idea that I wanted to do a profile of him. I mean, a young artist who has found a thing and doesn't keep going on it is very impressive. And so anyway, the next time I was in LA, I contacted Charlie, and he set up a meeting with Romero Gomez right here. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about what's going on in there.
Yeah, hello guys. I certainly came from a Mexican immigrant family as a child, born to them in San Bernardino, 2 hours east of here. I grew up in a very tight-knit family. I was lucky to have family members at Cross, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and they formed a circle in that San Bernardino community that I was born into, and with lots of cousins and grandmother that helped care for me while my parents were working in these physically demanding jobs, my mother as a janitor and my father as a truck driver. I grew to understand the environment in the domestic sense. Caring for kids is super natural to me as well, as I helped out with younger siblings and younger cousins. But it's interesting, as I was growing up, I naturally developed creative tendencies, and at the same time, these childcare abilities were there. So I found a relationship with a man, David Feldman, a filmmaker, who actually encouraged me to explore this creative side and move out to the California Institute of the Arts around 2007. That experience actually was very short-lived. I didn't last very long in a conceptual school.
I sometimes tease him that California Institute of the Art in those days was very into theory and critique, all about people like Ramiro, but really not addressing Ramiro in terms of your life, and you lasted a year, basically.
Yeah, but it's interesting, the same, at the time, boyfriend, David Feldman, he was in the entertainment industry and worked as an editor, and around 2009, a friend of his, a coworker of his, approached the office and said, we need a nanny. Our nanny quit abruptly. And with my childcare experience, I, during CalArts, actually coincidentally, worked at a childcare center near campus just to make ends meet. And so the experience I had there led to this random offer to become a live-in nanny. And
one time out here is when you go see the Pear Blossom Highway, you know, that intersection in the David Hockney thing? That would be an intersection that David, going from Valencia to San Bernardino, kept on going by. But then, anyway, so you take up this job.
And that's, again, a very important thing to symbolize or highlight is 2009 with this offer was turbulent, because not only did I drop out of the school at that time, around the same time, but also suffered the loss of this grandmother that had helped raise me. So two major hits on the same time as this offer that came around. Had no idea what that would lead to, but I remember distinctly my mother telling me right before I took this job, she said, we didn't come to this country to sacrifice ourselves for you to end up doing the very same job we do. And that stood with me, but I also had my partner David encourage me, saying, you know, explore this. The grief that I was going through at the time, I needed space to deal with. So that's what came about. What's interesting is these kids that I babysat were not my children, but when you come into this job, it's very hard to distinguish what is a job and what is a family. I, at the same time, as I said, was a live-in, so this family wasn't only providing me a job, but they were providing me a home, and they became a surrogate family for me. The grief that I, again, had with this grandmother's passing, I was able to process through caring for these children in the same way that she had cared for me. Bringing that up, though, these children also depended not just on my services there, but also the services of everybody else that came around, the other housekeepers, the cleaners, the pool cleaners. In fact, as I babysat, that's what started coming around, was these interactions, me taking care of the children here, but at the same time, the pool cleaner working on a Thursday afternoon, just like I was.
And Yuan said to me, and by the way, this is right near David's place, so these are the same hills. And Yuan said to me that the Hollywood Hills are from 10 o'clock until about 5 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock every day. It's a Latino town. And then starting around 5 o'clock, all the trucks and so forth go down, and all the limos and sports cars come up, and then it's an Anglo town until 10 o'clock the next morning and so forth. And
that transfer everybody sees. I mean, it's happening as you guys arrive here. You know, it's a certain thing that happens in Los Angeles. I see it in other parts of the world, but now that I've traveled, but in LA specifically at the time, I had been very aware of the arts, obviously as an artist, but this job was a necessity for me. I didn't take the job as an art project, but these connections to the other people who reminded me of my uncles, my aunts, who do the same types of jobs, that kind of thing started creating a need to talk about this environment.
So let's look at No Splash again.
Well, the thing about that interior, as this floor-to-ceiling door highlights in the pool right outside, it's very easy then to see David Hockney's version of A Bigger Splash. I feel like I am inside that house. I saw that, and yet nobody else saw it.
You told me one day that you were going to call this Thursday afternoon.
Thursday afternoons because of the coworkers that I had.
Right.
But when I started looking at David's work, David Hockney's work, I specifically said what the highlight was in his was the splash. By removing it, that simple removal of the splash, calling mine No Splash, and highlighting by inserting those figures that are so present there, including them in the painting, is a way of discussing and exploring that painting's relationship to current time, the contrast between the California cool and the movements around the 60s pop art movement and its influence.
Show some of the other examples.
Considering my interpretations are just so obvious, yet not included in art history. It's a simple device. Yes, when I started David's work with No Splash, I considered all these other paintings, like this one, Man Taking a Shower in Beverly Hills, and said, hey, just substituting for, the woman cleaning a shower in Beverly Hills, as the title of this piece is a commentary. It's a commentary in different ways also. The figuration involved in some of my pieces as opposed to the lack of the figure in the other pieces by David himself. I also look at this in an interesting way. I had to repaint his paintings at different scales. These were not to the scale of his originals, but I learned so much from the taping process, building up his environment first. And once I finished the environment, the painted scene, the clean aspect of California's representation as his did, the figure inserted is a different way of articulating pop art or representing pop art.
One of the things I think about when I think about David is he arrives in Los Angeles, and in this series of paintings that around this time, he makes us see Los Angeles. There's also, when you see the apartments, buildings, when you see the signs, the street signs, when you see the sprinklers and so forth, nobody had thought of this as a subject for art or as something that could be lifted to that level. And in some ways, what you're doing is this other stuff that's invisible to us all the time. I mean, they're everywhere, but workers, the domestic workers and so forth, but to make them in the same way and to do it through the David's work was a very interesting kind of thing. Show a few more just so we could.
The interesting thing about this, including this one, which in his version called Beverly Hills Art Collector.
Yeah, it's what's her name, Freeman.
And inserting the housekeeper and calling mine Beverly Hills Housekeeper.
Right.
I'm playing with a title.
Right.
I'm playing with the subject. In fact, in this case here, I specifically put the figure where his had been. Most of his paintings didn't include the figures. That was the challenge, as well as figuring out where in the environment that he had painted do these figures come in. And as I painted mine, including things like the dustpan, the broom, into otherwise a painted to exact points version of his, it's an interesting commentary. As I said, it's pop art because everybody sees it. Yes, it's invisible unless you've perceived it or seen it yourself. And many of you in this environment here around the Getty Center in Beverly Hills, right across the freeway here, this is happening. There's many people in this audience who possibly can connect to this from the perspective of the homeowner, and others that probably could connect to it from the perspective of the worker, the child or the children of these workers, people I've encountered as I produce this work. That motivates me. And, there's a respect, but at the same time, there's a responsibility. As his work has represented California, I serve in the same way as an artist to represent California's current climates for many reasons. So
let's begin to wrap this up, but the point I want to make is when the first day I was talking with you, we were in the West Hollywood Park, and you were saying at one point, you said, I hope David Hockney, if he ever gets a chance to see these, won't think that I'm making fun of him. That would be the wrong way to look at it. It would really be hurtful because I don't feel that way at all. And then you, in fact, said on the contrary, Hockney had been incredibly important to you in ways besides an art influence. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, again, growing up in San Bernardino, I felt an isolation. Growing up as a creative person, there's one thing, but also being a gay male in a Latino family, that was isolating.
A macho Latino environment, basically? Or?
Yes, and my father's relationship with me was very difficult as the firstborn son. Not necessarily taking after him in many ways was a challenge. But in school, being lucky to have a public school education where art teachers recognized my talent and introduced me to things like David Hockney's book being in my art teacher's classroom, are very little small things that make a huge difference.
And in this case, I mean, literally, how he dealt with his homosexuality
through that casualness, though, the representation of homosexuality as so casual with his friends around the pool. Right. That stuff really appealed to me, especially considering it wasn't so easy for him to paint that. How casual it's seen is only now in the future, but at the time, can only imagine how difficult it was to portray and have that artwork come out and be displayed with so many people looking at homosexuality.
So we were having this conversation like this, which was very moving, and he just was saying, I just hope Hockney would not feel that I was making fun of him. And I said, well, why don't we go up and see him? And so we drove up to see him. And what was really wonderful is how David took it. First of all, David recognized that he was exactly the same age that David had been when David came to LA. And then he kept on showing, Ramiro kept showing pictures of his work on his iPad, and the one in particular of the lawnmower. David said, "Yeah, in my painting it has sprinklers," and he said, "Yeah, I know." And David said, "Yeah, no. When I came to California, when I came to LA, you have to understand, I came from Northern England, and we never saw sprinklers. I mean, when I came to LA, and I said, this is a town where when it rains from the ground up." Anyway, and so at a certain point, they both asked me to photograph them to commemorate the day, and then they both said, "Wait a second," that they could selfie themselves, and so I have a picture of the two of them selfieing themselves, anyway, and then what happened after that evening?
See, when I did that series, when I started it way back, as I mentioned, this job, it wasn't ever intended. Once the feelings started coming out and the ideas started becoming what they are, these paintings and this series of paintings, even meeting him wasn't something that I felt would ever really happen. Yeah, the nervousness was there, and I can remember as I see these objects, like, this actually was a cathartic moment for me to be standing with him and just selfieing and being me and him, childlike in the ways that we are as artists, free to like sort of let loose a little bit, especially because I was so nervous as to his reaction. I respect
he was very cool during the time, but all the drive down he was crying. It was
I mean, it was hard to deal as I drove up with you to his studio in his home. I was passing Mulholland Drive, exactly where I was working with his family and living with the family. I, in fact, drove obviously with you, but saw these gardeners on the back of a truck on my way to his studio.
And one thing, when you're with him, he's constantly photographing things that you hear a click, click, and you say, oh, that's right, there are hedge clipper people working over there, or there are gardeners on the back of a truck, And so anyway.
My cell phone is my sketchbook, especially because it's so quick and so ephemeral to pass by workers, and for me, documenting that is a start. Right. Very similar to how he probably observes just these books or paintings. For me, the phone gives me the access very quickly to document an image that later I process. And so after meeting him, this had already been a series that I had ended, but there's this little postcard that I had in my studio from LACMA where this piece, Mulholland Drive, the road to the studios, displayed. And as I sat there with the processing of the emotion of what had happened, of meeting him and the closure complete to that series, I still said that picture I took of the gardeners on the back of a truck needs something more. I need to paint this and insert it. And that postcard was a perfect situation. Again, with respect to him, but at the same time, with a lot of responsibility to document what I'm seeing, the reflection, including these figures into art history, figures that otherwise wouldn't. And then, in the case here, a painting on a postcard that I gave to David Hockney as a gift of appreciation to what he represents for me as a young artist in California, especially as a gay young artist. And, thinking about this idea of representations of workers going into juxtapose or almost add to that California cool pop art display that the movement and his paintings specifically have around the world.
Great. Thank you. Well, now from the youngest person on the panel to the oldest. I want to give you a biographical background before we do anything more about Father Pavel Florensky. Born in 1882, that's him there, in a secular family in Azerbaijan, very much a westernizing family. He was a mathematical prodigy, and indeed is well known in mathematics books for a whole other part of his life. In any case, in 1905, right after the 1905 revolution and its dashed hopes, he underwent a spiritual crisis and emerged from it convinced, even though he was doing lots of mathematics and lots of science, that what he had to do now was be a Russian Orthodox monk. And he went to a monastery. This is a picture of him with, I was going to say, it's not Bulgakov, but it's, but there he is. He was very highly regarded as a monk. At the same time, he eventually left the monkhood and became just a priest, a Russian Orthodox priest who could marry. He had 5 children. Basically, eventually they were from age 25 to age 5. I say he was a devoted father and an amazing scientist. I went too far. He did groundbreaking work in science, in mathematics, in technology, always in his monk's gown. You read his biography, there's this Monty Python-like scene. After the revolution, he was specializing eventually in technology and in the electrification of the Soviets. And Leon Trotsky shows up at the lab, this big lab where Florensky is working off in the corner, and says, who can we get to talk to the Central Committee about electrification of the villages? And they said, well, Florensky. And Trotsky says, Florensky is here? And they go to see him. And Florensky's in his monk's outfit. And he said, Trotsky says, would you be willing to talk to the Central Committee? And Florensky says yes, but his boss says, but you would have to take off your monk's garb. You'd have to go in a suit. And he said, well, then I can't do it. And Trotsky, this is the Monty Python part, says, you can't do it without your monk's garb? And he says, yes. He says, then you'll do it in your monk's garb, says Trotsky. And indeed, he went to the Central Committee, gave a talk. At first, there's all kinds of rustling in the audience about what a weird thing this is. But at the end, he got a standing ovation. He was very much involved in that. Things sour in the revolution. By 1932, Stalin is in charge, and he is exiled to Siberia. And in Siberia, he becomes an expert on permafrost, doing papers that are now being dusted off and looked at again because of what's happening in climate change. Very, very important work. And then in 1937, he's brought back to Leningrad. That's the height of the Stalinist terror. And executed in 1937, 80 years ago. I don't know whether David has realized that this is his 80th birthday and that this man who he's so excited about was executed the same year he was born. In any case, he is very much regarded as almost a saint in the Russian Orthodox realm. I would love to be able to bring him out here. Unfortunately, I can't. So the best we could do is bring somebody who knows a lot about Florensky, has learned a lot about Florensky just recently. Please welcome David Hockney. Are you there? David, we know that you have to smoke. And so there that is. And however, I want you to understand what a big deal this is. They do not allow smoking. And the Getty had to, Lino, are you back there? We have a person here whose job it is to supervise your You're smoking.
Well, I do now.
But feel free.
Okay.
Lito, you can go. Peter, does he have to be here the whole time? Can he just be back there if something happens? Well, Lito, you can go. Lito. Thank you, Lito. Thank you, but just, okay. Anyway, turning more serious, in that biography of Pavel Florensky, people might not understand why you're as excited as you are. For the last 6 months, anybody who talks to you gets almost as much about Pavel Florensky as about smoking. And so, by the way, look what there you are at different ages. And did you realize that he was born 80 years ago? That he died 80 years ago?
Yes, he died in 1937.
Exactly
he was
like
shot in 1937, 80 years ago. Yeah. I was born in 1937,
Right.
yeah.
So what else about him is interesting?
Well, we discovered him I was sitting in my studio looking at these 3 pictures that I'd painted in reverse perspective. And I was just talking to JP about it. And then I went to bed. And he typed in on Google reverse perspective. And eventually he found this essay and read it. And then I read it.
So let's understand that in addition to everything else we've said about Florensky, he is one of the leading art theorists of that time. He's incredibly influential on Malevich, on Kandinsky. He is as revered as an art theorist at that moment as he is a scientist and a mathematician.
When I read it,
it's about 80 pages.
80 pages, I was very, very excited because it confirmed to me about reverse perspective. I'd gotten interested in reverse perspective in 1975 when I painted a picture called Kirby after Hogarth, and then I put in brackets, useful knowledge. That was the title of the painting. Well, the useful knowledge was about reverse perspective. And I used it in the painting. I mean, the painting was of from a frontispiece on a treatise on perspective by somebody called John Kirby. And in Hogarth's version, it was all about all the mistakes you can make if you don't follow the rules of perspective. Well, I thought it was a terrific piece of work. So I did a version of it, and I used reverse perspective. The small sheep are at the front and the bigger at the back, and there's somebody lighting a pipe from an impossible position in a window and things. And I used reverse perspective a little bit in the 80s. And I've always known there was something wrong with perspective. I've always known this. And I've always known it's always about things close to you. I mean, it's perfectly clear and obvious that a road in a distance does that. Well, that's okay in the distance. But if you think about close to us, then the position of perspective is a bit odd, really. Your position. And in reverse perspective, of course, it comes to you.
So perspective, 1 point perspective, regular, it's all going away. Everything is going toward a point in the distance. And reverse is the opposite.
I'll tell you something that will make you understand this, I think. In 1985, we were in Milan doing the Magic Flute at La Scala. And we had a day off. And Ian and I decided we'd drive to Zurich for some rosti. Not far. And but what I didn't know was on the road going up to the tunnel, there was a snowstorm in Switzerland, and so there were no cars going into Switzerland. And as we got approaching the tunnel, I realized we were the only car on the road. And we entered the tunnel, and there was no car in front of me at all.
It's a straight tunnel for how long?
And it's a straight line for 18 kilometers, and then a small bend at the end. It's about 23 kilometers long. And if a car is in front of you, you'd keep your eye on the back lights, and if it brakes, you brake, and so on. But this was one straight line. It just came like that, and it takes 10 minutes, 15 minutes to drive this. And I said to Ian, this is a perspective nightmare. That's what it is. Because he was always doing that. And when you came out of the tunnel, you wanted to do that. And I think that's about reverse perspective. That is it, not that.
And Florensky, by the way, comes to this, as some of you have been reading up there, he comes to it as a defense of Russian icons. And he points out that people looking at Russian icons often say, well, they don't know how to, they're not very good at drawing. Look, that foot shouldn't be there. This is their feet seem to be going this way, then they're going that way. The nose is going one way, the mouth is going another. And a typical complaint about them is that they don't know how to paint. And he then goes on in language that is so similar to when you were doing Secret Knowledge with Charles, that, I mean, he used some of the very same examples. In fact, I just jumped out of my seat when this is a text written in 1920, and Florensky says that, you know how when a child is asked to draw, a 5-year-old is asked to draw a house, and he'll put the front of the house, the back of the house, the dog house in the back of the house, the tree in the back of the house. It's all on one line, continuous. And then the art teacher comes and says, you're doing that wrong. And basically says you have to do it as if you were standing on one leg, looking through one eye without moving. That is what is correct. And that is basically, and Florensky also says that starts in 1430 in Bruges and in Florence. And he connects it with the Euclidean view, with Newtonian, and so various things like this, and that it holds sway that this is what people think is the only thing that's right. And it also reminds me of the thing you said, David, when you said that photography, which is 1 point perspective, is all right if you don't mind looking at the world from the point of view of a paralyzed cyclops for a split second. But then Florensky goes on to just show that clearly Egyptian painters, Babylonian painters, and so forth had geometry. They knew perspective, and if they didn't do perspective, it's because they chose not to do it. And
I mean, the Egyptians knew about triangulation. Look at
sure. And the Babylonians knew the stars. I mean, it's obvious that they knew how to do it, and Florensky makes these very strong arguments. And what to me, when you told me to read it, this is exactly the conversations you were having 15 years ago, and without any knowledge of this. I mean, I just, by the way, you can find this online. You just go.
You can get the essay online.
Right.
I'd highly recommend it to anybody. It's very rigorous. I mean, he goes into everything.
But he's got, there's long sections on Raphael and on Leonardo and so forth. Incredible. One of the things that Florensky was like, and this reminds me of you, David, is he's a great noticer. He notices something in the Last Supper. He notices something and really brings out great points. In any case, as you say, I just wanted to bring out a little bit of the kind of thing that you have been doing. In the pictures you do of your blue deck, most of them that you've done historically have been in one point perspective, or basically receding. And then just recently, what was this, 4 or 5 months ago, you did this lower one, right? That's the one you did in reverse. This lower one is in reverse perspective, correct?
No.
Isn't it?
Well.
No, you were.
Yes, but this isn't the one. The reverse perspective one has the corners.
But
I thought this was.
Well, I was going to say, this is how it started.
This is how it started. I painted this picture, which I thought was a bit reverse perspective. And then I was just sitting there, and all I did was chop off the corners, actually.
And then the next thing you got to was something like this.
And that's the painting I did, the first one.
And chopped off corners enforces a reverse perspective almost.
I don't know why I hadn't chopped off the corners 20 years ago. I mean, because it's a very satisfying shape, I think. Very satisfying. I don't think you notice it's odd. Right. And for reverse perspective, it's terrific.
And then the one you did after that was based on this here. What's this?
And then the first painting I did, I thought it looked like an Annunciation.
Let me go back and show that again. The two flowers.
And I thought it had the clarity of an Annunciation by Fra Angelica. That's Fra Angelica. And I've always admired that painting. I've known it since the age of 11 because it was on the corridor top corridor at Bradford Grammar School. And it was always how they're in space. I mean, I always loved it because of the way they are in space.
But then you wanted to see what they would, but that is basically regular perspective, right?
Yes.
And then you wanted to see what it would look like in reverse perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, just the difference in spaciousness is, I think, amazing. It breathes.
Reading Florensky's essay, it's like someone was summarizing conversations you had with me 15 years ago that he independently had seen. You have to read this essay. It's tough going. It's not 80 pages of, it's not evening reading. You sit there with a highlighter, read it, and you'll understand what David figured out for himself.
Yeah. And then, by the way, just one more. You're going to be doing a show of reverse perspective in New York in November, I believe, at Pace.
Well, I put it off just a bit because it's too early. I mean, I have to do the paintings.
But you are.
We did have. I have a show in Paris at the moment. And these 3 paintings are in the show. I mean, I did get from the Tate gallery show, which was in February, I did 5 paintings since then. and all of them are in Paris. We got them all in. They're not all in the catalogue because it had gone to press, but we got all the pictures in, and I thought it made an end to the show that was much better because it was the future. I was dealing with the future now.
As of a couple of weeks ago, you were talking about this painting.
This painting was
By Hobbema, right?
Hobbema, and this is in the National Gallery, London. And I'd always liked this painting because I know with the trees so close to you, you have to be looking up. So you're not just looking forward, you're looking up and seeing the sky. And I always liked the painting. I'm sure that's the reason. So I'm just doing another version of it, and I've done it.
So I'll show you, the painting is called The Avenue at Middle House or something like that. The Avenue, that being the Avenue. And your version gets rid of the Avenue.
That's a first version of it, yes. And I used the road as the negative space and then reverse it in the foreground. And it makes the space look bigger. It does look bigger and wider. And I think wider perspectives are needed now.
Especially now.
I do, actually. And if you think about it, perspective is photography, really. The photograph is now the ultimate perspective picture. But they're getting too boring, photographs, I think. I mean, I notice on Facebook or anything, if there's a drawing, they stand out more. They do. Even not so good drawings stand out. So drawing will have to come back. I mean, it won't go away.
So, summarizing, you are not retiring at age 80.
No, I'm not. No, but I'm staying in my studio. I'm not going out much. I don't come out much because I'm too deaf to come out.
Do you think your deafness is affecting your sense of space?
Well, I think it made me see space clearer. If you're going deaf, I mean, if you're going blind, you locate yourself in space through sound. Well, if you're going deaf, maybe you'll locate yourself in space with visual things. But how would you know this unless you were going to use it? And I think I'm using it, really. So I have noticed that. I noticed this a long time ago. I mentioned it. I did point out, for instance, Picasso was probably tone deaf because he had no interest in music at all. He never bothered about music. He said he couldn't tell the masterpieces. And so he was probably tone deaf. But tone you can use for sound and vision. And with vision, he could see more tones than anybody else because the chiaroscuro is stunning, isn't it? Even in those first drawings.
I think, by the way, that as I think about it, as you're talking, I mean, our ears are on the side of our head, And hearing, in terms of space, it really is, we can see in front of ourselves pretty easily, but we get a sense of the space that we're walking through hearing things off to the side. And since you don't have that, your eyes are, your perspectives are getting wider to make up for that.
You know, I can see my hands here, but I don't see them clearly, but I can see them there. That's wide. It's wide. We see. I don't think we see with perspective.
Well, this has been really wonderful. We're exactly an hour and a half in, so we'd promised to stop about now. But I think what we can all agree is, first of all, we can just all thank David for 80 years of spectacular work. And look forward to much more. And it's just exciting that we have a whole show of this kind of stuff coming. So, and I wanted to thank the panel members too. And usually what happens at the end of these things is people rush the stage. Lino? Yep. Please allow David, as he says, he doesn't hear very well. It kind of bothers him to have people rushing the stage. David is going to go back there. You are going to go up there. And Lino is going to make sure you don't come here. And thank you, Lino.